Last time on Adapting the Cosmere.
And while Sanderson has found great success so far in his career, he is currently the most popular author with the most books sold who has yet to have one of his works adapted for the big or small screen. Ergo, he should be next in line. And I, like Sanderson himself, am happy to report that that is all likely to change very soon, because after an extremely successful Kickstarter in 2022, currently the most successful Kickstarter of all time, studios are lining up to nab the adaptation rights to his works, and Sanderson is patiently awaiting the right offer and the right time to strike to make the biggest impact possible in Hollywood. Look, at the end of the day, the Cosmere is going to happen. Whether it's reduced to mere series on Amazon and Netflix or a hybrid with theatrical blockbusters, it's going to arrive, and I just hope it gets the attention and respect that it deserves. The stories that Sanderson has told and continues to tell touch the hearts of many, and I know I'm ready to give my money and see them play out on the big or small screen. The Cosmere cinematic universe is on its way. Denying and suppressing that truth will only make a Shallan out of you. It might not happen next year or even the year after that, but within our lifetimes, and especially within Brandon Sanderson's, we will be seeing live-action adaptations of the Cosmere. It's as true as pattern is weird.
You can say that again.
Now, we've already discussed at length which studios might make the most sense at this current moment. However, that list is likely to change year to year, heck, even month to month, considering the random headlines we get, like Apple being in talks of buying Paramount, or Disney and Warner Brothers potentially merging or bundling their streaming services into one platform. And while I do believe my overall reasoning behind each major studio still holds water, as we looked at each studio's brand, historical decision-making, and current business practices, the conversation that I think is even more valuable is how to actually go about adapting a huge interlocking series such as the Cosmere. And luckily, we have a handy blueprint to work off of thanks to this little thing known as the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This decade-plus long project has provided us with a highly successful model for an interconnected cinematic universe filled with examples of elements to follow as well as some to avoid. So today, we'll be spending some time going over each and every project set within Era 1 of the Cosmere and how that might translate to the big and small screens. What changes should be made to the source material? In what order should these movies be released? And which stories should be relegated or promoted to a season of television instead? And of course, what post-credit scenes would make the most sense? We'll be talking about all this and more, and in full spoilers, so if you're not caught up on the Cosmere today, specifically on the first Mistborn trilogy, Secret History, Elantris, and Warbreaker, please be advised that you will be spoiled on some very crucial storylines. I will also be speaking on novellas from the Arcanum Unbounded, as well as the White Sand graphic novels, but fear not if you haven't read those yet. I won't be discussing anything beyond their premises. However, if you are caught up or you just don't care about spoilers, well then stay tuned and buckle up, World Hoppers. The weather in Shadesmar is looking rather bumpy today. If you were to stop and ask someone with which book should you start your Cosmere journey, you would get a plethora of responses. Mistborn, Elantris, Warbreaker, Stormlight, those are the most frequently advised entry points as they're the four pillars of the Cosmere in many ways. But now, with the secret projects all out and about, many have begun to recommend those as entry points to their friends and family, including Sanderson. Heck, I've even seen some people recommend the Alloy of Law, which at one point might have been a fine place to start, but is now just considered a cruel suggestion with the Lost Metals release. So, lucky for us, when it comes to adapting the Cosmere into a visual medium for film or TV, we don't need to decide where exactly to start. Sanderson has done the hard work for us already and put to rest all conjecture and speculation. Because we know exactly where he intends to kick things off. Mistborn. In fact, he's been hard at work at writing the screenplay for the past few years now. And while he's confident in the story, he has conceded to the fact that screenwriting and book writing are very different arts, and so he'll want a professional to write the final draft. And personally, I think that's very wise, as it's an entirely different storytelling medium, and it will give him more time to spend on writing new stories. So, Georgie, if you're listening, take notes. And in fact, we actually know quite a few details about this planned Mistborn movie already. For one, we know that Sanderson intends for Vin, and thus the general audience viewer, to learn about allomancy during an early action chase scene of sorts, where Kelsier is instructing Vin on the different metals and their powers for Mistborn as the need for one pops up. Which is actually a neat little callback to the 11th Metal, a short story where we see Kelsier learning the ropes himself. Secondly, we know that Sanderson wants to gender swap a few key characters because he feels remorse over the lack of female protagonists. So we might very well see a female Hammond and Doxson in a live-action adaptation, and perhaps even some new female characters as well. So, to all the fan casters out there, it's time to get to work. We can also safely assume he might shift more focus onto the existing female characters, such as Vin and even Sean Alariel, whom Sanderson intends to make Ellen's sister, tweaking her role from simply being Vin's rival as Ellen's potential suitor. And this brings me to the third biggest factoid we know about Sanderson's Mistborn movie, and even more just his general approach to adaptations. The right actors to him are not typecasted.
The thing about it is, however, I know that actors, good ones, have a lot of range. And because of this, I don't generally say, oh, I would love this actor, I would love this actor. For Hoyd, what I see is people like to pick, naturally, actors who have played a character like this before, which always makes me a little uncomfortable, right? Like, if people want to get Tom Hiddleston to play Hoyd, I'm sure he would nail the role, but they say that because he's done that before. And if you were using this method of casting, I don't think people would have cast Tom Hiddleston as Loki.
He believes most professional actors can pull off these roles, and so he's more concerned about other things such as their chemistry on screen and their ethnicity or appearances being accurate representations of the source material. So I guess that rules out Netflix and Disney.
Oh, shots fired! Oh!
And the main reason we know all this is actually thanks to the Man of Steel himself, Henry Cavill. You see, Henry Cavill is a huge fan of the Cosmere and has been in contact with Sanderson and Dragonsteel over potentially playing a character and or narrating an audiobook for him. Cavill in the past has requested to play Kaladin, and Brando Sando was very upfront with him that his ethnicity and age are just not what he's looking for in Stormblessed. But I don't think Cavill is too upset over this. He's got a baby on the way and his Warhammer 40k series still in development. But that's not to say that I would not love to see him pop up in the Cosmere at some point down the road.
Once in a while, I have something in the back of my head that I'd love to do. Like Keanu Reeves has been the Lord Ruler in the back of my head for quite a long time.
However, apparently Keanu Reeves would make the perfect Lord Ruler in Sanderson's eyes, and Hugh Jackman the perfect Kelsier.
Hugh Jackman? He can't pull off this material. He's a song and dance man. I'm sick. I'm just sick over this.
That could be the potatoes.
Who are these Warner brothers? Is there one who's like the leader, so if I get to him, the others will fall in line? Because I need them to not release this movie.
I don't personally see it, but something I do see at this moment in time is Glenn Powell as our Lord of Scars. Just think about it. Now, another huge thing we know is that Sanderson also wants to get ahead of the game and fix the Atium retcon right out of the gate with this first adaptation. If you'd like to learn more about this retcon, you should check out Jasoni Owen's video, which I'll link in the description below, but in essence, god metals are supposed to be burnable by anyone, but in Era 1, it's only Mistborn or Atium Mistings who are able to do it. So Sanderson retconned this in Era 2, saying that in Era 1, Atium was not pure Atium. It was an Atium Electrum alloy instead. This has many ramifications for the book series and potential hurdles for adaptations, but again, check out Jasoni Owen's video for the full picture. Personally, I don't mind this retcon for the movies, as it only makes pure Atium that much more rare, boosting its pure form scarcity and thus economic value, which would then also bolster Kelsier's overall plans to topple the Empire and take it all back. It would also make identifying pure Atium Mistings that much more difficult, as I'm not sure if one would even be able to burn the alloy. That might only be an ability of a Mistborn. However, my friends over at the Cosmere Academy and Cosmere Quandaries have suggested potential ways to get around this hiccup. For one, just having pure atium from the very beginning would probably work just as well, considering how rare the metal is, and the fact that people wouldn't just be going around letting others try atium to test if they're a Mistborn or Misting. I mean, how many times has someone asked you to taste a little plutonium on the off chance it gives you superpowers? Sanderson also has the Lord Ruler's false rhetoric at his disposal, as well as his manipulation of another rare resource in the Final Empire, the truth. Simply gatekeeping the truth might further add to the setting, the themes, and the atmosphere of this story, and allow for another cool reveal in our first movie, Sanderlanche. And again, it's a way to further reserve atium and thus drive up its economic value and legitimacy of the heist. The only hiccup that I can foresee is this potentially complicating Preservation's plans of the 16%. I don't know what that might look like with these changes, however, if anyone could find a way to make it all work, it would be Sanderson. And if we're following the logic of my last video, he retains all, count it, all creative control and final say for these adaptation stories. So with that all said, I don't personally think the story should change all that much, omitting minor scenes here and there and combining a few story threads to allow for a solid 2-hour-ish runtime is very common for adaptations, and I think that approach should still apply to Mistborn Era 1. Maybe diluting the ballroom scenes or combining Vin's lessons with Kelsier's crew members into a shorter sequence, I don't know. At the end of the day, my golden rule for changing story elements within adaptations is that 1, it has to be at least as good, if not better, than what you're changing it from, while 2, keeping the spirit of the story intact. Changes need to stay true to the original story and faithful to their characters. Otherwise, it's not an adaptation, it's an artistic retelling, or an interpretation. So, as long as the direction and final vision embodies the overall heart and soul of the series, I think truncating it is perfectly fine and fans should be supportive of that. In fact, that's what I think the approach should be for all of these projects overall. However, where my vision of the Cosmere cinematic universe greatly differs from the publication order of the book series lies in Era 1's post-credit scenes, because we've gotta have post-credit scenes these days, as well as when and where certain reveals should be made. So, starting off with Mistborn: The Final Empire, my first hot take of the day is that the post-credit scene should feature a tease of Kelsier surviving his death, sort of, as he enters the spiritual realm, refuses to enter the Beyond, and has a short exchange with a being called Fuzz. I picture it as something like this. Kelsier appears in a misty landscape and meets a figure whom he names Fuzz. Kelsier is shocked and confused at first, asking where he is, and so Fuzz then teases that there is so much more to learn and informs Kelsier that he's a god, the Shard of Preservation. So, rightly furious, Kelsier punches him in the face, and then we cut to black. Now, before you die-hard Cosmere purists out there order a hit on me, let me explain, because I promise there is a method to my madness, and I can almost guarantee that by the end of this discussion, we will all be in agreement on this. For those of you not in the know, many Sander fans get up in arms when you recommend reading Secret History right after Era 1, instead of waiting for After Bands of Mourning, Book 6 of the series, as Sanderson originally intended it. And that's because it spoils a pretty huge reveal that a certain character is still alive. Well, again, sort of. But what exactly is a spoiler? This is, I believe, the true heart of this debate, and why both sides are absolutely right and dead wrong. So I'm going to let the amazing Cody Leach explain what a true spoiler is, especially when it comes to films, because in my opinion, he nails it on the head here.
But what do I actually consider to be a legit spoiler? And it's very simple for me. Any information that fundamentally will change my first viewing experience with a film. Now, what does that mean? Oftentimes with films, there are a reveal, or there is a twist, or there's a surprise, or a cameo, or an undocumented side character. There's something in the movie experience that the filmmaker, the scriptwriter, the storytellers certainly would not want the viewers to know ahead of time. It is a part of the journey they want to take you on with their story. And those are the elements that I would consider to be a spoiler. You will only ever have two types of viewing experiences with any given movie that you watch throughout your lifetime. You have your first viewing experience where you walk in at least somewhat unknown about what you're about to watch and the journey you're about to go on. And then you have the second experience, which is every single experience you are going to have rewatching it for the rest of your life. And you only have one chance at that first viewing experience. And anything that compromises or taints or dilutes that first viewing experience is what I consider to be a spoiler.
Now, the debate of the proper reading order for Secret History is never going to have an official answer, unfortunately, because at the root of this argument is the notion that the best time to reveal that Kelsier is still alive should be entirely up to the reader, posthumously, of course. The issue is that readers simply won't know for themselves until after they've read it, but by the end, they'll have already experienced this reveal. And yes, I'm aware that Sanderson might have initially intended, and perhaps even still recommends, for it to be read after Bands of Mourning, but he also recommends Tress of the Emerald Sea as a great starting point to the Cosmere, despite it being immensely Cosmere connected, being set in Era 4 or 5, and not at all indicative of his overall writing style. But anyways, back to the point, when it comes to films, these moments, these shocking reveals, are easily stolen, easily tarnished, easily spoiled, with the main culprit for this being clickbait news sites and social media platforms. Now, that's not to say that some of these channels and companies don't do great things for the online film community. However, they are full-time aggressors of this sin as they vie for clicks, and unfortunately, there's just no stopping them. And thus, there's no true prevention from spoiling first-time consumers of the Cosmere through the films. So, to get ahead of this, we reveal that Kelsier is alive, but no longer in the physical realm, and tease that there is more to come from his story, so that the general audience actually gets to experience this twist for themselves, not have it spoiled and have that magical moment stolen from them. And what's even better, people will want to know right away what Kelsier gets up to. This will lead to many picking up the books to discover for themselves, thus converting movie watchers into readers and, hopefully, full-on Cosmere adapters. This in turn will only boost sales more for both the books and films when you factor in things like DVDs, thus feeding this vicious cycle and boosting the chances for this cinematic universe. The only caveat to all this that I can foresee pertains to the rare few who have only read Era 1 or even just the first book ahead of the film's release, and thus the post-credit scene might spoil that reading experience down the line. However, again, I would also argue that seeing it happen on the big screen might be the preferred avenue to this reveal for many, and would coerce those light readers to quicken their pace and finish reading the series. Plus, we're only showing them a quick glimpse of Kelsier's future storyline, and it will give these readers something to look out for during and hopefully enhance the rest of their reading experience. But I've spent more than enough time on the Final Empire. What could the other post-credits look like for the Mistborn trilogy? Well, after the events of Well of Ascension, where we learn more about both ruin and preservation, especially Lerasium and the power at the well beneath Kredik Shah, I think it would make sense to show that Kelsier was trapped in the well alongside Ruin, and thus was also freed when Vin took up the power only to release it. Afterwards, Preservation would then tell Kelsier that he must head across the ocean for help, where the screen then cuts to black to let the audience mull over the implications of these events and those parting words. However, we can't stop there, because now that we've earned a sequel for Mistborn adaptations, we've also earned a second post-credit scene. The former would be a mid-credit scene, which would then be followed by the post-credit scene, which depicts a mysterious man picking up a Lerasium bead and then looking into the camera to reveal Hoid, who then winks and walks off screen. This should be Hoid's third appearance within these first two films, and if done right, the audience should be suspicious of his character by this point, and if not, well, then he certainly earned some suspicion after this short little scene. And yes, in case you missed it, Hoid would wink at the camera because Hoid should most definitely break the fourth wall at times, especially when it's just himself on screen. Hoid is the ultimate storyteller, the ultimate world hopper, and to me, it just makes sense to add that extra level of quirkiness, such as breaking the fourth wall. I'm not talking She-Hulk or Deadpool levels of it here, just those rare instances when he's not being observed by others on screen. And again, for you purists out there, we can explain this away as maybe he's so highly invested in the cinematic universe version of the Cosmere that this is just another added perk to his insane level of BEUs. That's breath equivalent units to all the new readers out there. But lastly, as for the Hero of Ages, where we learn even more about shards, hemalurgy, and the realms of the Cosmere, I think our mid-credit scene should consist of Kelsier's conversation with Harmony, where he's told that there is no way for him to return to the physical realm, and Kelsier then concludes that Sazed is a terrible liar.
But the fact is, you are a liar, aren't you?
Yes. So you are a liar. End of story.
Our post-credit scene could then show Kelsier reaching out to Spook and recruiting him to an unnamed group of Scadril heroes, which readers would readily recognize as the secretive organization of the Ghostbloods, and then end with Kelsier saying that they need to learn more about hemalurgy so he can regain a connection to the physical realm. How much of Kelsier's behind-the-scenes journey is shown is a decision well above my pay grade. I could see varying amounts working in different ways, though I would worry that packing in too much of it would take away from future projects and add too much to this film's already quite long runtime. Look, the last thing I'd want is for the Hero of Ages to get the Part 1 and 2 treatment, as Part 1 would be an absolute snooze fest for many new fans, and it's something I hope Sanderson fights against if and when these films do start doing well at the box office and the studio's eyes light up with dollar signs. But anyways, what's important that I'd like to call out here is now after these three films and their various glimpses into Kelsier's looming background presence, we've earned this nice little Nick Fury moment with a tease of his secret agenda and developing organization. And personally, as a huge fan of the source material, I think all these little scenes give good glimpses into big ideas and neat reveals from secret history without giving away Kelsier's entire journey in the cognitive realm. A journey that I think we should see on screen, but not necessarily in theaters. That's right, while production is underway for the next two films on our slate, I think we should get a TV movie of sorts, or maybe a miniseries if that's the preferred route, which would showcase Kelsier's otherworldly journey, piecing together all the snippets we've seen up to this point, and providing the full narrative of how exactly Kelsier survived, what all he got up to during the events of the Mistborn trilogy, and setting up his Ghostbloods arc. Which leads me to one of my other hot takes today, in that we should get an anthology series, tentatively titled Arcanum Unbounded, where each season contains tie-in projects for the big budget films. Sticking to the MCU comparison here, this would be like putting a condensed season of What If together with shorter projects like Werewolf by Night or the Guardians Holiday Special under the same banner.
What? Are you crazy?
Are you crazy?
What are you, crazy?
Just to signify that, hey, these are stories that pertain to the cinematic universe, but aren't exactly required watches to understand the main storylines. They are supplementary watches which may become mandatory down the line as storylines start to intermix. And so Season 1 of Arcanum Unbounded, or maybe just Arcanum Unbounded Era 1, could include projects like Secret History, The Emperor's Soul, and perhaps even a 6-episode limited series for White Sand. But why stop there? Whichever studio picks up the Cosmere might also want to include the behind the making of specials, which have become oh so popular for franchises like the MCU and Game of Thrones. Or perhaps a new Cosmere story, which would be developed solely for the big screen. I mean, we all know how much Sanderson loves to surprise his fans, and this is definitely something he would try to pull off. Heck, you could even toss in shorts and tie-ins, especially animated ones, ahead of major projects to tease these worlds, much like the actual Arcanum Unbounded does with Chris's writings. Having a collection of 5-minute shorts where Cosmere worlds, terms, and principles are explained in a way that's in line with the book series, but doesn't give away major twists and reveals, could be a super fun and engaging idea that Sanderson might be interested in. Honestly, I'm kind of shocked he hasn't done this already with his own company, but then again, that's kind of what the Arcanum Unbounded is for anyways. Now, these are all just ideas that I'm tossing out here, and I am by no means married to any of them, nor do I consider them absolutely essential. But if they did want to go all in with ideas like these, they shouldn't feel pressure to dump them all into a single banner like Arcanum Unbounded. I'd actually suggest considering different banners outside of it. The last thing we'd want is for the Arcanum Unbounded title to be seen as the junk drawer by the fans. So keeping it to just the bigger budget projects like Secret History and Emperor's Soul would be the preferred route. Honestly guys, I'm just such a huge fan of anthologies and could see this format working really well for the Cosmere cinematic universe. In fact, it kind of already has with the Secret projects, 4 unrelated stories, 3 of which were set in the Cosmere, which were all released under that same banner of the Secret Projects Kickstarter. The Cosmere is so vast, and the series is only growing by the day, it feels like, so having an IP in the cinematic universe which signifies, hey, this is part of the Cosmere, but it's not required to understand the major films and storylines, isn't the worst idea by any means. Now, White Sand is a tricky one, as it's pretty much Sanderson's Dune, a huge epic on a desert world, which is vitally important for big Cosmere events down the line. So having that be an animated series could be a great idea, as it already exists in the graphic novel form and would buy some time for casting directors to nail down who should play these roles when the need for them in live action arrives later on in the Cosmere's timeline. However, unfortunately, many general audience members tend to write off animated projects, which could make this a riskier one. But again, the genius of lumping it together with Secret History and Emperor's Soul under that same banner of the Arcanum Unbounded would signify that it holds equal importance for the overarching narrative. The final 2 adapted projects that would appear under this banner would be a fall project for the Halloween season, and then a tie-in for another movie. Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell is largely considered Sanderson's most horror-adjacent story in the Cosmere so far. That's not to say there aren't horror elements in other series like Mistborn and the Stormlight Archive, but Shadows for Silence is certainly considered the scariest one given the tone, the rules of the world, and the fact that ghouls run amok in the literal Forests of Hell. Let's just say it's not a highly sought-after vacation spot amongst world hoppers, nor is it a highly possible one if you want to get technical. Now, we don't know exactly when this story takes place in the current Cosmere timeline, an elusive construct at the moment, which Sanderson has promised is in the works. However, we do know that it takes place somewhere towards the end of Era 1, and definitely before the Stormlight Archive, which is set in the early Era 2. So for the purpose of this thought experiment, we'll have it be the final project in Era 1, a sort of palette cleanser for the bigger projects, and a tease for more interconnectedness to come in Era 2, perhaps going so far as to set up the evil shard of Odium. If you know, you know. But don't worry, I'll give you a realistic timeline for all these projects towards the end of this video. But finally, the other project that we could see under the Arcanum Unbounded banner is The Hope of Elantris, which would come out after the Elantris film and serve as an extended cutscene of sorts that depicts the finale through the eyes of another character. It's a super fun short story on its own and definitely isn't required to be adapted, but for the sake of this video, we'll include it as a possibility. However, in all honesty, I think having a single line refer to it would work better for the film, as it might convert further curious viewers into readers. But that's more than enough chit-chat on Arcanum Unbounded. Let's get into the 2 other film franchises that will kickstart Era 1 of the Cosmere Cinematic Universe, Elantris and Warbreaker. Both of these films are going to have their fair share of challenges to overcome in terms of balancing the tone of each film and faithfully adapting the source material. For one, Elantris is quite dark and political, so keeping those elements front and center without going over any lines Sanderson doesn't wish to cross, while still remaining interesting and accurate, will certainly be a challenge. And then Warbreaker is Sanderson's steamiest book so far in terms of innuendos and romantic subplots. Now, luckily, Mistborn has both of these elements quite heavily entwined in its story, with monsters like Inquisitors, Kandra, and Kolos, and then the balls of the noble houses, as well as Vin's and Ellen's relationship. Which all just makes the Mistborn trilogy that much more important to get right, and fully set the scene for the entire first era of the Cosmere. However, the biggest flaws, in my opinion, for Elantris and Warbreaker have to do with the source material itself, the actual plots, and certain story beats. Now remember, it's perfectly reasonable for there to be some changes when adapting novels. It should be expected, and when done right, applauded. It's hard enough to write a good story once. Doing it twice is another feat all on its own. However, I think we can anticipate some pretty major changes for these two films' stories, similar to ones we might see in the Mistborn trilogy. And luckily, I think they're ones that Sanderson has been mulling over for quite some time now. Elantris is quite commonly referred to as Sanderson's weakest novel. While it was his 6th written book, it was his first to be published, and so with that comes plenty of baggage. Is it as bad as some people claim? No, even Sanderson's worst works go toe-to-toe with some of the best in the genre. And honestly, in my humble opinion, I greatly enjoyed my first read-through of Elantris, even more so than many other fan favorites, including Warbreaker, and I had read it after everything up until the Lost Metals release. However, with that said, it's still not the most memorable story from Era 1. It is rather basic and has a very simple structure where it simply rotates between 3 points of view until the big finale, aka the Sanderlanche. But at the same time, to give credit where credit's due, it provided the skeleton and baseline for all future Cosmere works, in terms of characters, magic systems, politics, and themes. It also introduced the pattern of undead creatures, or zombie varietals, which, seriously, are way more common than you'd think. Rayod Elantrians, Skeletals, Fracus, Lifeless, Shades, the list goes on. However, all that said, there are some very forgettable things from that first story that will need a deeper review when making the final screenplay. Obviously, there are 2 planned sequels at this moment, and we as readers simply don't know what will or will not be expanded upon in those future installments. But nonetheless, it will be important for Sanderson and his team to nail down what absolutely needs to be adapted, what needs to be tweaked or further fleshed out, and what can be repurposed or outright canned. Things like the relationships between major characters, as well as the personalities of certain characters, all need to be fully thought out and explored on the screen, as movies lean much more on the actors than a narrator's competence and reliability. And looking at Sanderson's annotations for Elantris, it's quite obvious how non-committed or tentative he was in regards to certain characters. My good friend Seth from the Cosmere Academy also recommends making further mentions of the other religions and magical arts from the other countries, and I'm inclined to agree. If the goal is to make more sequels and have Elantris be just as Cosmere connected as other projects, then this will certainly be vital. Not to mention, it will also set up that connective tissue with the Emperor's Soul adaptation in the Arcanum Unbounded. Seth also reminded me of a story beat that I had completely forgot about in myself, which just goes to show how forgettable this piece of the puzzle was. Eodon ritually sacrificing his staff didn't really contribute to the story all that much, aside from maybe discrediting his character. However, the thing is, that story beat felt like it came out of left field, and there are probably better ways to discredit the king that don't compromise the overall narrative. Now, luckily, there is still plenty of time to hammer out these little details which make a huge impact altogether. And I'm sure that these things will remain on Sanderson's mind as he gets to outlining and then writing the last 2 books of the Elantris trilogy. But again, the devil is in the details, and these details need to be cemented before even a single frame is shot. Now, looking at Warbreaker, its biggest weaknesses lie in the Deus Ex Machinas of Vasher and the God King. On one hand, I loved the Vasher and Nightblood plotline, especially when Vivenna is folded in. But on the other hand, I'm also fully aware of how many readers felt blindsided by the conclusion to that story and didn't feel as satisfied as us Cosmere veterans. So, finding the right balance will be important so as to not lose interest within the general audience. The God King and his ending is another Deus Ex Machina, one which Sanderson fully cops to and wishes that there had been a better way of handling. And so, because of that fact, I have full confidence that this is another thing he's been mulling over all this time and will want to replace with something new that he's come up with. But personally, I think keeping it simple might solve both of these problems, with simply incorporating more foreshadowing and properly setting up these twists and reveals. And with it coming out after Mistborn and Elantris, this might be even easier in movie form. You see, when Sanderson originally devised the story for Warbreaker, he had already written and published Elantris and the Mistborn trilogy, which both explored similar themes such as survival, loneliness, and faith, as well as similar story constructs like a band of mercenaries and royal politics. So when Sanderson set out to write Warbreaker, he had intended for it to be a reversal on these shared aspects of story. For example, Warbreaker contains a benign god king rather than a tyrannical lord ruler, a villainous band of mercenaries rather than a heroic one, and a girl trained by a mysterious godlike being whom she sought out, rather than a girl trained by a jovial godlike being who sought her out. Heck, even the roles of Vivenna and Ciri are intentional reversals themselves, as they constantly swap positions throughout the book, with Sanderson making a real effort to display their contrasting stories in tandem to one another. And so all this should make it easier, in theory, to earn these quote-unquote Deus Ex Machinas on the screen, with foreshadowing existing not just in this one movie, but the entire cinematic universe up to this point. I still think Sanderson might want to tweak a few things here and there to make these moments feel even more earned and justified.
Oh, do you now?
But all I'm saying is that it might not even be that necessary, so long as the Easter eggs and comparisons are fully set up. Again, so long as any deviations from the source material follow our golden rule of adapting novels, these stories' heart and soul should still come through in the final product. So with all that out of the way, what do we tease with the post-credit scenes for these films? Well, for Elantris, I think it might be beneficial to set up Galadon's off-world travels in a mid-credit scene, or maybe something that sets up Elantris 2, which we don't know enough about yet. Perhaps the scene would have something to do with Keen or Wyrn, as we know the sequel is planned to revolve around their parts in the story. And then the post-credit scene could simply adapt Hoid's epilogue from the 10-year anniversary edition. This depicts him observing he's failed to become an Elantrian and thus access the Aeon Door, being scolded by a dark Seon known as a Skaze, which Sanderson in the past has referred to as an evil Seon, and then him hopping into the pool, Devotion's perpendicularity, and vanishing, thus giving us viewers yet another hint at what perpendicularities are capable of. Maybe he's headed to Scadrial in anticipation of the events of the Mistborn trilogy, which the viewer would then already be aware of, and thus tying this post-credit scene together with that of Well of Ascension. In this case, it might be wise to provide a timestamp of some sort to let the audience know that this film occurred before the Mistborn trilogy. Or maybe, if this takes place after Mistborn in this cinematic adaptation, Hoid is simply off to his next location. In which case, we could maybe see Galadon following after him, setting up his role during the events of the Way of Kings, or Season 1 of the Stormlight Archive. Now, as for Warbreaker, we could probably follow a similar template here, with the mid-credit scene teasing Vivenna's and Vasher's next chapter. This would have to be a tease for the planned sequel, Nightblood, as they don't cross over to Roshar until after the events of that story. But then the post-credit scene could do something unique here. Perhaps after seeing Hoid tell stories with sand in the Court of Gods, Hoid learns that he's running low on sand and needs to resupply. This would then tease the next project to come after Warbreaker, which would be White Sand. Now, there are two issues with this, which I feel the need to call out here, but they're not so incredibly complex that Sanderson couldn't make it work. I'm just not the guy to do it at this point in time. Firstly, the sand that Hoid uses to tell the story isn't technically white sand, or if it is, Hoid is sort of breaking the physics behind how the sand is supposed to work in the canon stories. Perhaps we just don't have him do that in his Warbreaker scene so as to not confuse viewers, or maybe it's better left in to further tease Hoid's mysteriousness and otherworldly abilities. You see, in the book, Hoid is able to turn the black sand back to white, but that requires a ton of investiture. However, if the many post-credit scenes are to be of any indication of Hoid's immaculate level of BEUs, again remember he is breaking the fourth wall here, we could ascertain that he might possess this capability. Plus, this would give the added benefit of further connecting these projects. However, the second major issue here is that Autonomy, the Shard of Taldane, where White Sand takes place, absolutely detests Hoid. So him slipping on and off that world unscathed might not be the most believable, but then again, if there was someone who would be able to do such a thing, it would be Hoid. So consider me conflicted.
I'm conflicted.
Oh, by the way, while we're on the subject of Warbreaker, I just want to toss this out, but since Sanderson loves Hugh Jackman and Keanu Reeves, might I suggest either of them for the role of Vasher? In my opinion, they would make much better Vashers than Lord Rulers or Kelsiers, but hey, maybe I'm typecasting again.
Oh boy, here we go again.
Jasoni Owen also made a great point to me that Cavill could definitely pull off a great Vasher as well, and hey, then he could show up in Stormlight, which we know he desperately wants to do. So, great thinking there, Jason. If anything, Cavalrine only gives me more faith in him pulling off the role of Vasher. So, there you have it, folks. Those are my main thoughts on how to go about adapting Era 1 from a high-scale, bird's-eye view. There is so much more we could discuss. I could talk Cosmere adaptations all day long, but I think we've covered the biggest points that matter for now. So let's cap things off with what a realistic timeline and release order for these projects could look like. And so starting off with Mistborn yet again, let's say that they finally settle on the distribution rights and funding in 2026 and are able to start production in early 2027, then we would be perfectly set up to get a Mistborn movie just in time for 2028's holiday season, sometime in November or December. Look, we don't want to compete with all these blockbuster franchises releasing in that overcrowded summer season right off the bat, okay? We want a fun movie for the whole family that comes out when everyone has time for a trip to the theaters. Who knows, maybe they could have the release date align with 2028's Light Day, their version of Black Friday. And so, assuming all goes well with the box office and critic responses, Dragonsteel Productions and their distributor are greenlit for the next two movies to finish off the trilogy and gauge further interest for an expanded cinematic universe. Following a similar timeline of the MCU's Phase 1, but also a better version of it, within 3 years, 2031 if you're paying attention, we would see Mistborn 2, The Well of Ascension released, followed by The Hero of Ages 2 years later in 2023. That is 5 whole years for 3 movies, which sounds like a lot of waiting in between films, I know, but again, it's valuable time that allows Sanderson to continue writing more novels and to get his ducks in a row for the incoming Cosmere cinematic universe. It is Sanderson paying his dues to the industry so that we can eventually get a new movie or season of TV every year or two. And so, as I mentioned earlier, while Warbreaker and Elantris are in their various phases of production, 2034 and 2035 would give us the first 2 installments of Arcanum Unbounded, Mistborn's Secret History, and then The Emperor's Soul. And come 2036, we would get our first duo release of films with Elantris and Warbreaker, which would be separated by the 3rd installment of Arcanum Unbounded, The Hope of Elantris, which again would just be an extended cutscene for the Elantris film, if it's adapted at all, and would be filmed concurrently with Elantris. After cashing in on a huge year like this, it would make sense to recalibrate and align the next row of ducks, so it might be some time before we get our next project, which in this case would be a limited series adaptation of White Sand. This would begin airing as early as Q4 2037. Again, still biding time and hammering out details for the next slate of projects, Era 2, 2038 gives us the final installment of Arcanum Unbounded during the Halloween season, Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell. And there you have it, a hopefully realistic and conservative timeline for a fully adapted Cosmere Era 1. I know there are so many other ways of going about a huge feat like this, and I welcome all your thoughts, theories, and suggestions down below in the comment section. This is just my personal thought experiment and how I could see it potentially being executed. And before any of you ask where things like the 11th Metal or 6 of the Dusk are, I figured if you really wanted to show the 11th Metal, it would fit best as a quick flashback scene, maybe even a cold open for Secret History. And as for 6 of the Dusk, we already know this story is set sometime in the space age of the Cosmere and will be included in Secret Project number 5 as a flashback sequence. So we would have to wait quite some time before ever seeing it on the big or small screen. But that's enough from me today. I can already hear my voice withering away. I want to hear your thoughts on all this down below. If you are a fan of the Cosmere, make sure to check out all my other Cosmere videos, which include reviews, rankings, and even some comedy skits. And consider subscribing to the channel so that you don't miss out on future videos like my upcoming theory crafting collaboration with Rapho and the Silverlight Guide to the Cosmere, among many others. But as for now, that's it from me. Thank you all so much for tuning in and sticking around. I will see you all next time.